So now that we got the basic shape placed where we want it, I want to modify this cone shape to kind of zigzag and be more organic, more like a carrot. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to modify this parametric primitive. We're going to convert it into a polygon object. So again, I'll just, with the object selected, I got a couple of different options. I can roll my mouse over here to this button just underneath File and Undo, and make the object editable. You'll also notice that the shortcut key is C, which is what I'll use. I'll just tap the C key, and I'll confirm that I converted my carrot, and it looks pretty good. I have my polygon icon here. I've lost my parameters, so I know that this is an object I can now modify. Now, I'm going to use the Live Select tool just to the left of the Move tool, and the Live Select tool will allow us to select the components of our 3D object as we looked at in the previous presentation. So what I want to do is I want to choose the different components that I want to select. Now, in some cases, it might be more compelling to select the points rather than edges and polygons. And in this case, I'm most interested in the edges or the points that are around this cone shape. So to demonstrate this, what I'll do is I'll select points. Now I could do this with edges too, but I feel like I can be a little more precise in this mode with points. And I'm just going to click and drag and just paint around the object. Okay, now I need to orbit to the other side to grab those other points that I might be missing from this perspective. So I'm just holding down the Option key, clicking and dragging. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click and drag to paint the other points. Now there's a fair chance that I am missing a point or two at the bottom. I'm pretty confident that I got all the top points. And I can find out really quickly if I move these points. You can see that there's some points down here that didn't move. So I'm going to Command Z. I'll hold down the Option key again. Hold down the Option key and just orbit underneath, and I can see that I missed one point. That's the point that's missing. So I'll hold down the Shift key and I'll click and drag. Now, if I want to deselect points, there's a couple of different ways. If I want to deselect everything, I can just click off in the workspace and I'll lose that selection. But if I want to just selectively deselect a point or an edge or a polygon, I can do that by holding down the Control key and painting over anything that's selected. If I hold down the Shift key and paint over, it'll add to the existing selection. So I have my points selected. I'm pretty certain I got all of those points. And now I'm just going to lift this up. And maybe I'll push it back in space a little bit too. So you can see that I have now kind of a more organic shape for my carrot. So let's do that again. I'm going to skip this row of edges. And I'm going to go with this row here. So I'll just click and paint and a little bit further away. I'll Option click and drag to orbit around. And I'll Shift click so I can continue to add to that selection. I'll just kind of look around to make sure I got everything. It looks like I missed a point. There's a point missing under there, so I'll just kind of zoom in, hold down the Shift key. So you can see you'll soon get the hang of navigating the space pretty quickly. Just kind of move that. So I'm just kind of going for this sort of organic shape. Now there's a couple of different ways that we can make selections. I can manually paint around the object with the Live Select tool, but with the Live tool selected, if I look over here in the Attributes Manager and I'm looking under the options for the tool, there's a couple of interesting tools here, or interesting options within the tool. The first thing is the radius. The radius is the size of the hotspot. If I bump that up to 20, you can see that my Live Select tool has a bigger area of influence at this point. And I'll just take that back down to 10. The most important thing, I think, is this only select visible elements. Now, with only select visible elements, by default, this is on. And by default, what that means is if I flatten this view out to a side view, and I click and drag and paint some points, use the Live Select to paint some points, when I orbit around the other side, the non-visible points were not selected. Well, let's just click off in the workspace here. If I uncheck only select visible elements and I paint across that, when I orbit around, I got all the points. So this allows me to select points on the side of the object that we don't see. Now this can be a very dangerous thing, and in fact when I orbited around here, I found that I actually missed a point over here. So I'll just manually kind of fix that point, but it's easy to do. It's easy to overlook that. So one of the techniques, I'll just deselect. One of the techniques that I can use is, rather than using this perspective viewport to select these points, and I feel pretty confident that I can get to this with a kind of a nice flat view, and I can increase the radius of my live select tool, and I'm pretty certain I'll be able to select those points. But if I jump out into a flat view and I look at this from one of the sides, either right or left, I'll just zoom in. From this view, because it's a flat view and because I have only select visible elements turned off, in this case, when I click and drag and paint through, I'm certain that I selected everything that I need to. So I can take those points now and move it in an alternate viewport. Okay, so it gives me a little bit more information. I'll jump back into the perspective viewport. I only go into those flat side views when I absolutely need to be super precise or need a different view of things. So let me just go down here and fix this point that I goofed up the first time. And so I'll just kind of move that over. And I can see that those points are crossing. I pushed it into the geometry. I'll just pull it down. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, I actually want this to have a little bit of irregularity to it. So I exaggerated that caret quite a bit. Now there's a few other ways that we can select this these loops as well. If I go into edge mode, as I mentioned, we can also select the edges, but you can see why that might be a little bit kind of inefficient, because it's hard in this case to select those. Now that's why I've chosen to go into point mode. Now when we're in any of these selection modes, there's a couple of opportunities to select things that can be really, really useful. If we go into the select menu, you can see that there's lots of different kinds of things that we can do with a selection. And the one that I want to draw your attention to is the loop selection or the path selection. Now I'll start with the loop selection. And what the loop selection does is it will select a loop of points, edges, or polygons, depending on what mode we're in over here. I'm in point mode. You'll notice that as I roll around, it's selecting a full loop of, in this case, points. Now, if I use the vertical or the height segments, you can see that it kind of zigzags around the object. But if I use these rotational, and I'm just rolling my mouse over the edge between 2 points, so I'm in point mode, I've gone to select, loop selection, and if I roll my mouse in between 2 points, you can see that it highlights that entire loop around the 3D object. So I'm just going to one click with the mouse, and now I have that entire loop selected. I'll go back to the move tool, and I'll just move that back over just a little bit. Now, I can also use this path selection tool, which is pretty neat. If I go to path selection, what this will allow me to do is click and drag, and I can just kind of zigzag around this object. Now, I don't want to make this kind of selection, but you can see what a path selection does is kind of selects continuous points. Okay, so in this case, I think the loop selection is probably going to be the easiest thing to do, or you can just manually use the live select tool and click and drag to paint around. Now, when it comes to the live select tool, remember, if you've turned off only select visible elements in the attributes manager, be sure to turn that back on when you're done with it, because in most cases, I think you're going to want to be able to just select the points that you see, or the edges or polygons, whichever way you want to go with it. And it's really easy if you end up in a situation where you want to model something and you want to just select these polygons here and do something like, create a little dent or a hole here. We can do that with a couple of different techniques, but if I wanted to introduce some additional geometry, I can do that. But if I have the live select tool selected and I have only select visible turned off, it's really easy to select some geometry and think that you're only affecting one side of it. And I'll just do an exaggerated extrusion here, but you can see that I had other polygons selected on the backside. And so as I ran that function it generated some geometry in some undesirable places. Although unless I wanted some front teeth on my snowman, maybe I'm getting to something, but I'll Command Z to undo that. So that's the basic strategy. Again, I'll just review that really quickly. I'm going to generate a cone, and I'll just move this kind of up and off to the side for this demonstration. I'm going to reduce the radius down to something that's a little bit more reasonable, and the height as well. So the first decision that I made was to determine how much segmentation I want in the object. And now when we're selecting lots of different points or polygons, I think you can see the advantage of having only the amount of information that you need inside an object. So I'm going to take the height segments down to 6, and I'll take the rotational segments down to about 18. At this point, if I want to start to modify this content, I need to make it editable. So as long as that cone is selected, in this case, or whatever the object is, if I click on this button over here or tap the C key, at this point I can start to modify or select the components of this 3D object. I'll just go into point mode, and what I like to do is use the live select tool. I like to make sure that only select visible is turned on, and I generally just kind of, in this situation, I'd probably use the loop selection. But I'm just adding to that selection by holding down the shift key. And the workflow that I like to use is I'll roll my mouse off in this workspace. You can't select an object components. You can't select an object's components unless you have that object selected. Okay, so if for some reason I have this cone selected, if I wanted to try to modify the caret over here or select points, I couldn't do that because I have the cone selected. When I did that, you can see that all it did was deselect the points. So when I click off in kind of the negative space or another area of the scene, because I have this test cone selected, it's just deselecting those points. I'm going to tap the O key, which is frame the object that is selected. So I have S, which is frame selected, and O, which is frame the object. Now I'm going to select around this object just with painting with the live select tool, and I'll hold down the shift key and start off in this workspace and click and drag back into the object. Okay, if I find myself in a situation where I over select some things, that's okay. I'm missing a point here. It's kind of hard to see, but I just missed that point right there. So I'll shift click and paint. But if I over select, I can on a Mac hold down the control key, I believe it's Alt on PC, and just paint back over the points that I don't want included. At this point, what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing the axis tool and moving those points. Because they're all selected, they're going to move together. In addition to moving points, I can also rotate points if I had a compelling reason to rotate those. I don't think I do in this case. But I can also scale points. And scaling, we haven't looked at this yet, but you can scale objects, certain objects, and you can also scale the component parts of an object. And just like moving an object, we can influence one axis at a time, or we can restrict it to a plane by using these little corner markers here. Or if we wanted to scale something uniformly, so according to all three axes, in this case it'd be the same thing as restricting the scale to X and Z. I'm just out here in the workspace with this selected, with this tool selected, I can just click and drag left or right in the workspace, and it'll scale according to all three directions, or all three axes. Okay, so I don't really want to scale my caret, but I do want a couple of options. So you can see that sometimes when I navigate, I'm kind of flying around, and that's because it's orbiting around the point at which I click to orbit. Okay, so because I'm using this option click method, I'm finding myself in a situation where I'm not orbiting necessarily in the center of the scene. I'm orbiting based on what I click on. So I want to make sure I option click, and then I'll orbit around that point. Okay, so that's getting a little hard to navigate. Just make sure that you have an object in front of you. I'll share some other methods with you in the near future about how to navigate the scene. In the event that you get lost, okay, and you kind of have a funny click and say, I have no idea how to get back, or I'm all completely disoriented like this. What I like to do is just select one of the objects in the object manager, and as long as your mouse has focus over the perspective view, you can usually tap the O key, which will frame the object. At that point, we'll just kind of zoom out and see what we're looking at. Just kind of a quick, easy way to get back to a frame of reference. Okay, so modify your carrot, put a carrot-like material on this as well. We'll finish up the snowman by throwing a hat on with a couple of different objects, and then we'll just kind of do a quick pass to organize our scene. At that point, we'll talk a little bit about rendering, and then it'll be up to you to kind of experiment with what we've looked at in this project, creative ways to build out a scene based on all the information that we have. But we'll continue on in the next presentation.